The common name of my organism is called club fungi, and the mushroom is a part of it. The mushroom belongs to the phylum Basidiomycota that have characteristics such as filamentous eukaryotic and heterotrophic fungi and hyphae that reproduce asexually or sexually, along with many other characteristics. Basidiomycota are found in all moist terrestrial ecosystems, along with freshwater and marine habitats. The common name of my organism is also the earthworm or the common earthworm. Earthworms belong to the phylum Annelidea, which consists of segmented worms that have bilaterally symmetrical and vermiform bodies, along with many other characteristics. Depending on the type of worm, it can live in leaf litter, the organo-mineral soil layer, or in the soil, typically in moist environments. In fungi and mushrooms, there are cells that are exposed to the environment that have receptors on them that can respond to light, gravity, touch, and can sense the presence of nearby objects. When these signals are obtained, the extracellular signaling molecules bind to receptors located in or on the cell that trigger events inside the cell to respond to the signal. The signals that involve touch and sensing nearby objects are important within the mushroom's environment because fungi grow in a variety of environments, causing them to grow on different surfaces. Therefore, the sense of touch is crucial for the fungi's interpretation of their environment and signals the hyphae where to grow. Earthworms have light-sensitive cells called photoreceptors on the skin that allow earthworms to detect differences in lighting, touch, and chemicals. Most photoreceptors are in the poststromium. The poststromium of the earthworm is innervated by poststromial nerves that are connected to the brain, which produces a response to the incoming signals. These signals are then sent out into the segmental nerves that signal the muscles what to do. Since earthworms typically live underground or in shaded areas, their light-sensitive cells let the earthworms know when they are out in sunlight because the sunlight will dry out their skin and alter life processes they perform. Both earthworms and mushrooms use environmental signals to be mobile in their environment. Earthworms use light-sensitive cells that allow them to detect light intensity so they can move out of the sun. Mushrooms can be mobile through their touch receptors that guide them in which direction to grow. The trophic level of mushrooms are decomposers, also known as detrivores. Mushrooms are also heterotrophic. A mushroom lives in its food, so its environment is its food source and must obtain nutrients from it to survive. Mushrooms have hyphae that branch as they grow, forming an interwoven group of hyphae called mycelium. The hyphae secrete chemical enzymes into their environment and food source, causing the tissues of the organism to release carbon compounds such as starches and sugars. Digestive enzymes break down the large organic molecules into smaller molecules that are absorbed by the hyphae and mycelium as food via diffusion. The mushroom can distribute nutrients from one cell to another due to the movement of cytoplasm between cells that are called septa. Fungi typically do not have waste excretion strategies because when they break down the organic molecules into smaller ones, they only take in the nutrients that they need. The trophic level of earthworms are decomposers, also known as detrivores. The earthworm lives in soil and eats what it lives in, so its environment must be filled with nutrients. The earthworm obtains nutrients by grabbing it with the pharynx and ingesting soil through the mouth and buccal cavity. Nutrients pass through the esophagus, crop, and into the gizzard. The gizzard contains muscles that grind up the food with the help of soil and sand. From the gizzard, the food goes into the intestines where it is further broken down to be absorbed. There is also a typhosol that increases intestine surface area and allows for more absorption of digested nutrients. Undigested material is released through the anus. Nephridia also remove metabolic waste such as ammonia from the earthworm's body by collecting it and converting it into urine and release it to the environment via the nephridiospores. The esophagus has calciferous glands that contain enzymes that fix carbon dioxide gas by reacting it with calcium from the ingested material to produce a calcium carbonate which is passed out through the anus. Carbon dioxide must be excreted since it's acidic. The mushroom and earthworm both maximize surface area to volume ratio during digestion to maximize the absorption of nutrients. This can be seen in the earthworm in the typhosol and mushrooms in the hyphae. Waste from mushrooms consists of organic molecules such as carbon, nitrogen, and other elements that they digest externally and don't take into their bodies. This allows bacteria to process these elements into a form that is accessible to living plants. Mushrooms live in a very moist environment, which helps to facilitate waste removal. The movement of small molecules and enzymes is dependent on the presence of water, which digests molecules and leaves what it doesn't need in the environment as waste. The moist environment helps facilitate osmoregulation since there is lots of water available that can move into the cells via diffusion to maintain proper water levels. Earthworms' waste consists of urine and feces. Nephridiospores release ammonia into the environment that birds and insects convert into uric acid, which is less toxic to the environment. Earthworms release waste from the anus that is rich in nutrients and replenish the soil, spurring plant growth. Earthworms live in moist environments, which allows the ammonia that is released to be eliminated very quickly since it is soluble in water. Also, water helps move particles such as excess nitrogen. An earthworm's moist environment helps to regulate osmoregulation because it has high amounts of water, allowing water to readily move into the earthworm's body via osmosis. The cuticle layer of the earthworm's skin helps retain water because mucus is excreted through tiny pores in the cuticle, which prevents the earthworm from drying out. Both mushrooms and earthworms require water for moving nutrients, removing toxins from their bodies, and for osmoregulation.
So fungi actually lack a centralized respiratory system, so that means they have to rely on other means for gas exchange. So those means would be growing tiny hair-like structures known as hyphae. So if you look at the diagram on the left, a single one of these hairs labeled here would be a hyphae. And an interconnected web of hyphal appendages is known as the mycelium. So this entire thing right here would be the mycelium. And the entire mycelium is able to extend deep into the soil and reach gas pockets much lower than even plant roots are able to reach. This allows the fungus to access resources that are plentiful and relatively non-competitive. Oxygen enters the organism via diffusion, and oxygen enters through small pores on the hyphae and is used for cellular respiration. Through this respiratory process, carbon dioxide is produced and released into the soil, also via diffusion. If a mushroom were to sprout above ground, as shown at the top of this diagram here, the method of gas exchange would be similar to that of a plant, where small openings on the surface membrane of the fungus will allow for diffusion gas and the exchange of gas in and out of the organism. However, the mycelium will still be the main site for gas exchange. Here, we are able to see the entire mycelium versus a singular hyphal hair. And since the mycelium is able to grow so large and it's compacted with so many hyphal hairs, the surface area is maximized, allowing for greater volumes of gas to diffuse into the organism. Similar to the fungi, worms also lack a centralized respiratory system. They secrete mucus, which lubricates their skin, as seen in this diagram right here, which lubricates their skin, and they live in damp environments, which also help to lubricate the skin. The skin is mainly composed of the cuticle and epidermis, and oxygen diffuses through the skin so long as it is lubricated. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the skin, and oxygen enters capillaries just beneath the skin. The oxygen is used through the blood system and circulated via the circulatory system. And once it is all done, carbon dioxide is released out of the system, also via diffusion. In both organisms, the gases are able to diffuse through the membrane on account of the presence of a concentration gradient. This allows O2 to flow into the organism when the concentration is lower on the inside and allows CO2 to flow out of the organism via passive transport. Mushrooms are a non-vascular organism, which means they lack the internal circulatory system such as xylem or phloem, which you can find in many plants. Instead, mushrooms use their hyphae to interact directly with the environment. Hyphae are specialized cells within the mushroom that allow for the diffusion or passage of materials and nutrients in and out of the mushroom. This means that mushrooms get their nutrients and other required materials directly from their surroundings. So as you can see here in diagram B, nutrients are able to go in through the cytoplasm and septa and then be dispersed throughout the entire fungi. Worms have a closed circulatory system. The worm, much like a human, relies on a pump-like structure to generate enough force to adequately get the blood to flow throughout the entire body. Unlike humans, though, worms actually possess 5 hearts and all play a role in pumping blood. Worms also have 2 different vessel systems, the ventral vessel and the dorsal vessel. The ventral system carries blood to the back of the organism, while the dorsal vessel does the opposite and carries blood to the front of the organism. So when doing the dissection, we opened up the worm on the dorsal side, so the blood would be flowing through here to the front of the organism. And as you can see in the diagram to the right, the dorsal vessel is labeled at the top, and the ventral vessel is labeled below, so you can see the distinction between those two. Both mushrooms and worms have evolved systems which allow them to make use of nutrients in their environment. Mushrooms and worms both use tube-like structures to transport the materials throughout their bodies. Mushrooms have a complex networks of hyphae, while worms rely on a complex system of vessels through their closed circulatory system. Mushrooms can reproduce in 2 ways, through asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction, both of which are detailed on the diagram to the left. Mycelium are able to reproduce asexually by releasing spores from the gills located on the underside of the mushroom cap. The mushroom cap is the top portion of the mushroom and is, along with the other spore-producing cells located in the gills, known as the basidiocarp. The spores are released during the asexual reproduction process. These spores are produced through the process of mitosis and are therefore genetically identical to their mother species. It is also possible for a hyphae to break off and grow into its own independent mushroom. Mushrooms can also reproduce sexually. First, the basidiospore, a spore located by the basidiocarp of the mushroom, is released into the air. Then two spores from different mushrooms will join together through the process of plasmogamy and will form a dikaryotic basidia, a cell with two nuclei. Then the two nuclei will undergo karyogamy, where the two nuclei are fused to form a diploid nucleus. This zygote will then undergo meiosis, and during meiosis, there will be a point where the cell has four separate haploid nuclei, which will then migrate into their own haploid basidiospores. It should be noted that a mushroom that forms from the union of two different spores will be known as a diploid mycelium, while a mushroom that forms from a haploid cell is known as a haploid mycelia. Worms have both male and female reproductive organs. This makes them hermaphrodites. This means that worms have female reproductive systems and organs such as ovaries and oviducts, as well as male reproductive organs such as seminal vesicles, testes, and testis sacs. Despite this, worms still require a second worm to reproduce. Worms reproduce sexually by first secreting a mucus from their clitellum in order to form a tube made of slime. The worms will then pass through this slime tube using their cuticle exoskeleton to push themselves along, and as they do, the eggs are deposited as the tube passes over the female pore. Likewise, as the tube passes over the male pore, the spermathecal pores, the sperm are deposited. The fertilized eggs are then left in the mucus cocoon formed by the slime tube and develop from there. So both organisms are able to reproduce sexually. However, unlike mushrooms, worms can only reproduce sexually and cannot reproduce asexually. Both organisms, though, are at least in some capacity reliant on the union of the genetic material of another organism so that they are able to reproduce. So as for fun facts, a single portobello mushroom can contain more potassium than a banana. And for the earthworm, in 1 acre of land, there can be over 1 million earthworms. And while these just seem like fun facts, it is actually interesting to evaluate that both the mushrooms and the worms are great at decomposing organic materials. Both organisms are able to recycle vital nutrients back into the larger ecosystem by breaking down organic materials. This makes both organisms detritivores, or organisms that sustain themselves on dead organic materials. This also makes both organisms responsible for carrying out the process of bioturbation, which is the process through which nutrients are cycled through the environment through actions taken by organisms, such as burrowing, ingestion, or defecation. Through bioturbation, the soil and sediment is able to be reworked by these organisms.